Welcome back, everyone. I'm Yossi Goslin, NBA salary cap expert, and I'm going to talk about the Philadelphia 76ers offseason. They had a lot of cap space, and I want to talk about what exactly they did to put the team together and also get into what comes next because they are set up to do a couple moves in the trade deadline. If you're new to the channel or been here already, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and let's get into it. So first, I just want to quickly break down the Sixers cap sheet heading into the offseason. So they only had 5 players under contract and they had a ton of free agents. So they had two main goals they wanted to do. One, create the cap space needed to go after a max player and some other guys, but also they needed to make sure they can also re-sign Tyrese Maxey after. So in order to create the cap space, they needed to renounce all these free agent cap holes. So for example, if they renounce Tobias Harris, then they cannot re-sign him over the cap with his bird rights. They're gone now. So they only wanted to keep Tyrese Maxey's, and they also ended up keeping KJ Martin's. I'll explain a little bit later about that one. And they were basically projected to have somewhere between like around $50 million in cap space while keeping Tyrese Maxey. So here's a more simplified version of what they ended up doing to create their cap space. They renounced all those free agent cap holes except for Tyrese Maxey's and KJ Martin. So the only other players that they had under contract are Joel Embiid. They drafted Jerry McCain. They ended up keeping that pick, the 16th overall, and they kept Ricky Council. They hadn't cut Paul Reed yet until they ended up signing Caleb Martin because they didn't need to cut him yet, and they also cut Jeff Dowden ahead of free agency. So with these 3 players and the cap holes for Tyrese Maxey and KJ Martin, they were able to have a total of $60 million in cap space to spend. So the idea is that they're going to spend $60 million to sign Paul George and Andre Drummond and Caleb Martin. And then once they're at the salary cap line, they can go ahead and re-sign Tyrese Maxey to his maximum contract at 5 years, $205 million amount. And then they also kept Kenyon Martin Jr.'s small $2 million cap hold. He had full bird rights. So theoretically, they could have also re-signed them up to the max, something ridiculous. There was a lot of speculation that they might give him something very large and get to have him as a trade chip into the season. They didn't end up giving him quite that large of a salary, but they ended up re-signing him as well. So now I'm going to discuss what the Sixers ended up doing with their cap space, but I'm going to go in order of what was reported. So first, they agreed to sign Andre Drummond to 2 years, $10 million. And then there were some reports that they're going to sign Eric Gordon, but that's a minimum salary, so that wouldn't count against cap space. Same thing with Kelly Oubre. That was going to go into the $8 million room mid-level exception. So those signings would be done after the Sixers use their cap space. So then it was reported that they agreed to the max deal with Paul George at 4-year, $212 million deal. So that starts off at $49 million, and Andre Drummond's is at $5 million. So with all that, along with McCain, Ricky Council, and the cap holds for Tyrese Maxey and KJ Martin, the Sixers were left with $8.1 million in cap space. So that's what they ended up using to give Caleb Martin in his first year salary. But I'm going to get into his situation because it was a little more complicated than just giving him $8.1 million. So I removed Paul George and Andre Drummond, and that's because the Sixers officially signed Caleb Martin first, and there's a reason for this. So it's going to be a little confusing, but bear with me. So they gave him a base of 4 years, $35 million, but it can reach up to $40 million with incentives. So what they ended up doing in order to give him a little more than that 8.1 million is that they gave him unlikely incentives. So you can get up to 15% of your base salary in unlikely incentives. So 15% of that $8.1 million amount can allow him to reach up to $9.37 million in his first year. So whenever you're signing a player to a contract with cap space that has unlikely incentives, you need to have enough cap space to account for the base and the unlikely incentives. But the trick is that once you sign that player, then those unlikely incentives no longer count against the cap. So even though they signed him with $9.4 million in cap space, it then dropped back down to $8.1 million, like the exact amount of cap space that they would have had otherwise with had they signed Paul George and Andre Drummond first. So this allows him to earn a little bit more money, and this trick only works as long as you don't sign the player last. Then they officially signed Paul George and Andre Drummond, and they used up all their cap space, and then they went ahead and started to fill out the rest of the roster. They re-signed Tyrese Maxey to his max deal, starts at $35 million. They re-signed Kelly Oubre with the rumored level exception, starts at just under $8 million. And the only minimum signings they signed so far are Eric Gordon and Kyle Lowry, and they could really only sign minimum salaries going forward. They still need to get two more. So I already put in two more just placeholder veteran minimum slots just to show what the payroll is going to most likely end up looking like once they get the 14 players. The biggest need they have is wings right now, and there's a couple pretty good ones that they could potentially get for the minimum. There's guys like Cedi Osman, Gordon Hayward, Reggie Bullock, Justin Holiday, just to name a few. And I would say probably there's a chance they could at least get one of those guys. That'd be pretty great. Alternatively, they can trade for a player on a minimum salary, maybe like a Cam Reddish. The Lakers are trying to save some money, or maybe Keita Bates Diop. I think he might be injured, but just another guy that they on the minimum they could just absorb. So then the other thing they did was they re-signed KJ Martin. They gave him 2 years, $16 million. We still don't know what the exact salary structure is. I'm speculating there might be some likely bonuses to keep his base salary a little lower than that amount. And the second year is non-guaranteed, which basically confirms they gave him this deal so they can trade him later. I speculated earlier in my Sixers video how they could potentially sign and trade him, but that just got more complicated once they really started filling out the roster and signed Paul George with that big max salary. So it just made more sense at that point to re-sign him. And now they've got him on a deal that will be good for the trade deadline. He becomes trade eligible on January 15th. And there's a couple of ways that they can go about trading him. And the main thing to keep in mind is their relation to the apron level, because right now with this roster, they're going to be into the tax and they are over the first apron once they get the 14 players. So what does that mean? Well, they cannot trade him or really do any type of trade where they take back more money than they're sending out because they're over the first apron level. That's not allowed. So what they can do is aggregate him with multiple players, maybe 2 or 3 minimum salary guys, and try to take back someone who's making more than Kenyon Martin, but they're not sending out more than they're not taking in more than they're sending out. So one example is Dorian Finney-Smith. Let's just use him because that was a very trendy trade target as the Sixers were looking to get an answer at the 4. What they could do, for example, KJ Martin at around his $8 million salary, along with Eric Gordon and 2 more minimum players. So you're doing that 4 for 1, and yeah, that would exceed the $15 million salary that Dorian Finney-Smith is making. And then you could still fill out the rest of the roster and remain under the second apron, because once you aggregate multiple players in a trade, then you can no longer exceed that $188.9 million amount. So they'd be fine. They'd be able to do that type of deal. Alternatively, let's say no trade scenario comes along where they can get an upgrade. Maybe they could potentially get below the luxury tax line. I don't anticipate them going for that. I think they should be in a good position to get an upgrade. They've got several first round picks they can use to sweeten a package. But they're going to be about 11 million over the luxury tax line, the $170.8 million amount. So they could potentially just dump KJ Martin's $8 million and 2 more minimum salary players, and they could potentially get below the tax. But I wouldn't expect them more to do some type of trade that upgrades the roster. Overall, though, as far as their offseason, I enjoyed how it went down. As a cap guy, cap space has not really been the way to build teams anymore. It's been a while since we've seen a team get this creative and do a lot of cool stuff with cap space. So in that in that way, I enjoy the offseason that they had. But overall, I would also commend them for pulling this off, because I was getting a little skeptical that they might not even be able to get anyone quite as good as Paul George with their cap space. Just with the way cap space as a way to build a team has been trending, it just has not been a way to build your team and just build a really good one for that matter. With more players trending towards taking extensions, you gotta really like upgrade your team via trade and the draft. So not capitalizing on cap space after a year of planning and the whole way the James Harden thing went down, that would have been a disaster. Would I have gone this direction though? I'm not entirely sure. Um, I don't think I would have wanted to max out Paul George at his age right now. I think I would have rather gone a different path. I talked about something else, like what if they pursued, for example, Brandon Ingram, who is a max player, but his max salary is a lower tier. So if you were to bring in a guy like him, for example, yeah, he might not be quite as good as Paul George right now, but then you have more cap space to work with. You can get a slightly deeper roster. Just not entirely convinced that they positioned themselves to get over the Bucks, Knicks, Cavs tier that's like right below Boston. But I understand why they did it. This increases their chance to win the title this year for sure. And you can't control the market. They got really I think as far as what was available to them, they did a pretty good job getting who they could.